and welcome to Serenade, the podcast where we dive deep into the rich and fascinating world of music history. I'm your host, Bernard, and today we're travelling back in time, way back to the medieval period, to uncover the origins of medieval music in Europe. To guide us on this journey, we have a very special guest, Professor Stephen Howard, a distinguished music historian specialising in early Western music. Professor Howard, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Bernard. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about such a fascinating period in music history.
Let's start with the very beginning. When we talk about medieval music, what exactly do we mean? And how did it emerge in Europe?
That's a great question. The medieval period, in musical terms, spans roughly from the 5th century to the late 15th century. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe entered what we call the Middle Ages. And during this time, music evolved significantly. In the early medieval period, most of the music we know about was associated with the Christian church, especially Gregorian chant. This was a form of sacred monophonic music, meaning it had a single melodic line without harmony or accompaniment. Over time, as musical traditions developed, we see the emergence of secular, non-religious music as well, especially through the songs of troubadours and minstrels.
So would you say medieval music was primarily religious at first?
Yes, absolutely. The church played a dominant role in preserving and developing music, since literacy was rare and most written records were kept by monks. Sacred music is what we know best from this period. Gregorian chant, named after Pope Gregory I, became the standard liturgical music in the early Middle Ages. However, outside of monasteries, there was also a thriving secular tradition. People sang folk songs, performed dance music, and later, noble courts supported composers and poets who created more sophisticated pieces.
That's really interesting. So, apart from singing, what kind of instruments did medieval musicians use?
Medieval musicians had a variety of instruments, though they were quite different from what we use today. Some of the most common were string instruments like the lute and the viol, an early form of the violin, wind instruments like the shawm, a predecessor of the oboe, and the recorder. Percussion instruments such as hand drums, tambourines, and bells. The organ also became an important instrument in churches. It started as a simple device with small pipes and gradually developed into the grand church organs we think of today.
Now, when we listen to medieval music today, it sounds very different from what we're used to. What was the structure of medieval melodies like?
Great observation. Medieval melodies were typically quite simple compared to later music. In Gregorian chant, for instance, the melodies were flowing and free, without strict rhythm or meter. The idea was that the music should be a form of prayer, calm, meditative, and closely tied to the words of the sacred texts. In secular music, we start to see more rhythmic patterns, especially in dance music. These melodies often followed modes, ancient scales that gave medieval music its unique sound. Unlike the major and minor scales we use today, modes had different arrangements of whole and half steps, giving them a distinctive character.
So, early medieval music was mostly monophonic, but later composers started adding harmonies. How did that happen?
That's right. Around the 9th and 10th centuries, musicians began experimenting with polyphony, which means multiple independent musical lines sounding together. The earliest form of this was organum, where a second voice was added to a chant melody at a fixed interval, usually a perfect fourth or fifth. By the 12th and 13th centuries, composers in places like the Notre Dame School in Paris, especially Léonin and Perrotin, developed more complex forms of polyphony. They began writing music where voices moved independently, creating richer harmonies. This was a turning point in Western music history.
I imagine that as music became more complex, musicians needed a way to write it down. How did medieval music notation develop?
Exactly. Early medieval music was passed down orally, but around the 9th century, monks began developing neumes, a system of marks above the text that indicated the melodic shape. However, these neumes didn't show exact pitches or rhythms, just general direction. It wasn't until the 11th century that Guido of Arezzo, an Italian monk, invented a more precise notation system. He introduced the 4-line staff, which eventually led to the 5-line staff we use today. He also created the solmization system, the ancestor of do, re, mi, fa, sol, which helped singers learn melodies more easily.
Wow, this has been such an enlightening conversation, Professor Howard. We've covered the origins of medieval music, its instruments, melody and harmony, and even how it was written down. Before we go, is there a medieval piece you'd recommend for our listeners to check out?
Yes. If you want to experience medieval music, I'd suggest listening to Viderunt Omnes by Peritin. It's a stunning example of early polyphony from the Notre Dame school. And for a taste of secular music, you can't go wrong with the songs of Guillaume de Machaut, a 14th century composer and poet.
Fantastic. Thank you again for joining us today, Professor Howard. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise, Bernard. Thank you for having me.
And that wraps up today's episode of Serenade. If you enjoyed this discussion, make sure to subscribe and share it with fellow music lovers. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the world of music history. Until then, keep listening and keep exploring.